Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining me today for my talk on the regulatory landscape for novel protein ingredients in Europe. I'd just like to say a big thank you to the organisers of this event, Ahmed and Geza, for inviting me to talk today. So in today's talk, I'll be covering what is novel and how to assess whether your protein is indeed novel. I'll be giving a brief overview of the EU Novel Food Regulation and sort of outlining the key data requirements for a novel food dossier. I'll be highlighting the regulatory landscape surrounding alternative proteins and also highlighting any potential regulatory pitfalls that you may encounter and how to avoid them. Okay, so what is a novel food? So in the EU, a food ingredient or a manufacturing process that has not been consumed or used to a significant degree within the European Union prior to the 15th of May 1997 is considered novel and falls within the scope of the Novel Food Regulation, which is Regulation EU 2015-2283, and therefore will require an authorization. So under the Novel Food Regulation, we also have traditional foods. And traditional foods are those foods that are consumed as part of a customary diet of a large proportion of a population within a country outside of the EU. And traditional foods are usually whole foods that have been minimally processed. So this can be berries, nuts, legumes, flowers, etc. I'm not going to focus too much on this route today because I really want to just focus on the actual truly novel proteins, but it's just a note to say that the traditional food route can be very interesting for plant-based proteins, particularly things like seaweeds. So it's a good thing to consider. Something also very important to note is that food enzymes, food additives, flavorings, extraction solvents, and most importantly for the discussion today, GMO foods are not covered within the scope of the Novel Food Regulation. And all of these particular areas are covered by their own regulatory frameworks and their own regulations. So in the case of GMO, the GMO regulation is number 1829/2003. Okay, so how do you check whether your protein is indeed novel? So something else to be aware of is it is the legal responsibility of the food business operator. So that is the person that is legally responsible for placing the product on the market. It's their responsibility to check the novel status of their product. And sort of questions to ask yourself are, has your product been consumed in the EU prior to 1997? Does your product have a safe history of consumption? Has your product been consumed outside of the EU? And a very important question that's often overlooked is the manufacturing process and whether or not this is new or novel. So I'd like to go through an example of how to define whether a product is novel or not, and using a spirulina protein isolate as an example. So the first place to look is to check the Union list of novel foods and the online novel food catalogue. So the Union list of novel food is the basically the official regulation that lists all of the approved novel foods and their conditions of use. So this is a legal text. And then the online novel food catalogue is a searchable list that lists animal based, plant-based and other substances and their novel status within the EU. But this information is provided by EU member states and is not a legal status as such. It's just a reference. So in the case of spirulina, if we look at the novel food catalogue, it is there and its status is that it is not novel because it has been consumed to a significant degree prior to May 1997. So we can see that it's not necessarily novel, but then we need to go a little bit further than that. So we need to think about the manufacturing process. So we can assume that the manufacturing process of a protein isolate will be different to just the standardized manufacturing process for the dried and milled spirulina itself. And then the other thing to consider is whether the protein isolate differs in composition to that of the actual raw material or the raw spirulina. And we can assume that it would be different because the spirulina protein isolate will have a higher concentration of protein. So just doing a quick assessment, I would conclude that this spirulina protein isolate would indeed be novel. If you're still unsure about whether your product is novel or not, there is such a thing as a consultation process. So if you're not sure, you can consult with an EU member state. This should be the member state where you first intend to sell your product. And what you need to do is you need to compile a mini dossier and submit data on the product specification, the manufacturing process, history of safe use. So you submit this mini dossier, and then the member state has 4 months to evaluate that and give you a conclusion. However, this timeline may be extended if the member state requests more information from the applicant, or it may consult with other member states if it's a difficult case. So 4 months is what's written in the regulation, but this timeline can be extended. Something also to be made aware of is the consultation outcome will be published on the European Commission website. So if you're working on a top secret product and you want to keep this away from your competitors, then this might not be the route for you. Something also to note is that some member states are better than others with the whole consultation process, and the quality of the evaluation and the timeline differs greatly between member states. I just wanted to give you 2 examples of recent consultations. These are both for plant proteins. The first one is for a mung bean protein isolate that was submitted to the UK Food Standards Agency. And in this particular instance, the UK FSA concluded that mung bean protein isolate was novel. As I'm sure you're all aware, mung beans have a very long history of safe consumption, so it's quite difficult to understand why this would be novel. The UK FSA concluded that actually it's because the composition is different. So the protein is much more concentrated in the isolate, in the protein isolate, than it would be in a standard mung bean. And also the manufacturing process is novel. So overall, with their body of evidence, they decided that this particular ingredient would be classified as novel. So this case is actually very similar to the spirulina protein isolate I gave you earlier. And then the second example is pea and soy protein hydrolysates. And this consultation was submitted to the Irish Food Standards Agency. And in this case, they concluded that the pea and soy protein hydrolysates are not novel. And the reason why they got, or their reasoning was, is that pea and soy protein has a long history of safe consumption. And actually the manufacturing process is just a mild acid hydrolysis. And it's not a novel production method, particularly because it's very similar to what happens during normal protein digestion. So it's just interesting to highlight the differences and sort of the reasoning behind the different conclusions. So what do you have to do if your product is indeed novel? So you need to submit a novel food dossier to the European Commission. And then the European Commission issues a mandate to EFSA, which is the European Food Safety Authority. Once they receive the mandate from the European Commission, the EFSA will then perform a safety assessment and evaluate the dossier. Once this has been done, EFSA publishes their scientific opinion, and this is reviewed by the European Commission, and then they decide whether or not to grant the authorization. So the timeline for EFSA to evaluate the dossier is 9 months. However, this does not include time for clock stops. So clock stops are when EFSA pauses the evaluation process and reaches out to the applicant for more data or information on a specific topic. So basically the clock is stopped until EFSA receives the information they've requested from the applicant, and then the evaluation process starts again. So a realistic timeline from the submission of the dossier to getting your final authorization is 1.5 to 2 years. So what do you need to include in a novel food dossier? So all of the elements that you need to include are outlined in this particular regulation, 2017-2469, and the relevant EFSA guidance documents. But essentially, you need to submit data on the identity of the protein, the production process, compositional data, history of safe use, and then toxicological information and allergenicity assessment. So something to be aware of is that you can now, under the new novel food regulation, request data protection for proprietary information. So when you submit your dossier for certain studies, you can request data protection. So proprietary information includes toxicological studies, and this means that when the product is authorized, it's locked into the authorization holder for a period of 5 years. And this means that nobody else can benefit from your authorization or piggyback onto your authorization for a period of 5 years. So it's a very important thing to consider when you're building your dossier and submitting your dossier. I just briefly wanted to highlight some examples of the current regulatory status of some novel proteins. There have been a lot of dossiers submitted for biomasses and plant proteins over the past 2 years. However, we still haven't seen any submissions for any cell-based products yet. In terms of the biomasses and plant proteins, we've had one that has gone through the whole process and has been approved, but the others are at various stages of the EFSA evaluation process. Briefly, I just wanted to look at the regulatory landscape and the future of novel proteins. If you're not all aware, but you certainly will become aware, that the EU has a very, very tough regulatory framework. It's probably the toughest in the world, and it seems only to get tougher. It certainly doesn't get easier for applicants. You could say that it's thwarting innovation, but with the companies that are here today, I don't see that happening. I think more so the regulations are just meaning that it takes longer for these products to get to market, which is a shame. In terms of GMO, the EU is very hostile to GMO, and I can't see this changing anytime soon. So that again is just something to be aware of. A big thing that's happening in the regulatory world is this transparency regulation. So we're going to be having a new regulation on transparency that will apply from the 27th of March 2021. And this will change the way that information is shared with the public to do with regulatory products. So this also covers novel foods, but it covers other regulated areas like pesticides and feed additives, for example. I'm not going to go into this in much detail now because I don't have a lot of time, but it's just something to be very aware of. And if you can get your dossier in before the 27th of March, it would be advisable to do so. So just to highlight some regulatory pitfalls for the different sort of alternative protein areas, I'll start with cell-based meat. So as I've already mentioned, GMO is not very favorable within the European Union, and I don't think this is going to change. It doesn't mean that GMO cell lines will not get through or approved, but you will be in for a rocky ride throughout the whole evaluation process. So if you can develop cell lines that are not GMO, your route to market and your route through the whole safety evaluation will be much quicker. It's also really important to document the origin of your cell lines. So if you can get an animal health certificate, this isn't stated in the regulation, but you know, it could be something that they think of when they're evaluating the cell-based meat. So it's worthwhile making sure that you have the health status of the animals confirmed and on file. Also, the growth media and the scaffolding also need to be considered as part of the safety evaluation. So it's not just the final product that you're looking at in the safety evaluation, it's all of the elements, including the manufacturing process, right through to the final product, that need to be considered in your safety evaluation. So this is something to think of from a regulatory perspective as well. Also need to think of the nutritional value, and to demonstrate that the nutritional value of the cell-based meat is equivalent to that of normal meat. And for all novel proteins, allergenicity the allergenicity assessment is very important. For plant-based proteins, it can be really tricky to determine whether or not they are indeed novel. So you really need to drill down and think about the manufacturing process and the composition of the final product. And also allergenicity, you need to sort of think outside of the box and think about cross-reactivity with other plants and plant proteins. Also remember that the traditional food route is available, and ultimately this requires a lower investment and it's a quicker time to market. But it wouldn't be appropriate for plant protein isolates. It would only be appropriate for minimally processed products. And then for microbially derived proteins, you need to remember that it's not just the final product itself, it's also that needs the safety evaluation, but the production microorganism as well needs to be evaluated for safety. So in terms of the production microorganism, you need to present whole genome sequence data, need to demonstrate the absence of toxins, virulence factors, and antibiotic production, as well as antimicrobial resistance. In terms of the production microorganism, it's not such an issue if the production microorganism is GMO, as long as you can demonstrate an absence of GMO DNA in the final product. So again, that's something to be aware of. So take-home messages today. Yes, the EU has a very, very tough regulatory framework, and its sole purpose is safety and to protect the consumers, the environment, and what have you. I mean, I'm personally very grateful that they're very rigorous with their safety assessment, and we have the safest food chain in Europe, in the entire world. So I think, you know, we shouldn't try and make things easier and cut corners in terms of safety. Yes, the EU regulation on transparency, put this date in your diaries, the 27th of March 2021. This is going to be a game changer for industry, and there's a lot of things that you need to consider in relation to this new transparency regulation. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to say more about it, but I haven't had very much time today, but please do look it up and be aware that it's coming. It's vital, it's a legal responsibility that you check the legal status of your product before you place it on the market. And I would really advise you to consider your regulatory strategy from the very beginning of your product development, as this will save you a lot of time, energy, and heartache later down the line. So thank you all for listening, and please feel free to contact me via my email address, and any of our team would be very happy to speak to you if you have any regulatory questions. Okay, thank you very much.